Section 22 of Little Journeys to the Homes of American Statesmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Little Journeys to the Homes of American Statesmen by Elbert Hubbard. Section 22. Part 1. William H. Seward. I avow my adherence to the Union, with my friends, with my party, with my state, or without either, as they may determine, in every event of peace or war, with every consequence of honor or dishonor, of life or death. Speech in the United States Senate, 1860. William H. Seward. When I was a freshman at the Little Red Schoolhouse, the last exercise in the afternoon was spelling. The larger pupils stood in a line that ran down one aisle and curled clear around the stove. Well do I remember one winter when the biggest boy in the school stood at the tail end of the class most of the time, while at the head of the line, or always very near it, was a freckled, check-aproned girl who once at a spellin' bee had defeated even the teacher. This girl was 10 years older than myself, and I was then too small to spell with this first grade. But I watched the daily fight of wrestling with such big words as unintentionally and misunderstanding, and longed for a day when I, too, should take part and possibly stand next to this fine, smart girl, who often smiled at me approvingly. And I planned how I would hold her hand as we would stand there in line and mentally dare the master to come on with his dictionary. We two would be the smartest scholars of the school and always help each other in our sums. Yet when time had pushed me into the line, she of the check apron was not there, and even if she had been, I should not have dared to hold her hand. But I must not digress. The particular thing I wish to explain is that one day at recess the best scholar was in tears, and I went to her and asked what was the matter, and she told me that some of the big girls had openly declared that she, my fine, freckled girl, the check-aproned, the invincible, held her place at the head of the school only through favoritism. I burned with rage and resentment and proposed fight. Then I burst out crying, and together we mingled our tears. All this was long ago. Since then I have been in many climes and met many men and read history a bit, I hope not without profit. And this I have learned, that the person who stands at the head of his class, be he country lad or presidential candidate, is always the target for calumny and the unkindness of contemporaries who can neither appreciate nor understand. Not long ago I spent several days at Auburn, New York, so named by some pioneer who, when the 19th century was very young, journeyed thitherward with a copy of Goldsmith's Deserted Village in his pack. Auburn is a flourishing city of 30,000 inhabitants. It has beautiful wide streets, lined with elms that in places form an archway. There are churches to spare and schools galore and handsome residences. Then there are electric cars and electric lights and dynamos, with which men electrocute other men in the wink of an eye. I saw the fin de siècle guillotine, and sat in the chair, and the jubilant patentee told me that it was the quickest scheme for extinguishing life ever invented, patented Anno Christi 1895. Verily, we live in the age of push-button. And as I sat there I heard a laugh that was a quaver, and the sound of a stout cane emphasizing a jest struck against the stone floor. "We didn't have such things when I was a boy," came the tremulous voice. And then the newcomer explained to me that he was 87 years old last May, and that he well remembered a time when a plain oaken gallows and a strong rope were good enough for Auburn. "Provided Bill Seward didn't get the fellow free," added my new-found friend. Then the old man explained that he used to be a guard on the walls, and now he had a grandson who occupied the same office, and in answer to my question said he knew Seward as though he were a brother. Bill, he was the luckiest man ever in Auburn. He married rich and tumbled over bags of money if he just walked on the street. He believed in neither God nor devil, and had a pompous way o' making folks think he knew all about everything. To make folks think you know is just as well as to know, I suppose." And the old man laughed and struck his cane on the echoing floor of the cell. The sound and the place and the company gave me a creepy feeling, and I excused myself and made my way out past armed guards, through doorways where iron bars clicked and snapped, and steel bolts that held in 1,000 men shot back to let me out into a freer air and a better atmosphere. And as I passed through the last overhanging arch, where a one-armed guard wearing a GAR badge turned a needlessly big key, there came unbeckoned across my inward sight a vision of a check-aproned girl in tears, sobbing with head on desk. And I said to myself, yes, yes, country girl or statesman, you shall drink the bitter potion that is the penalty of success. Drink it to the very dregs. If you would escape moral and physical assassination, do nothing, say nothing, be nothing. Court obscurity, for only in oblivion does safety lie. All mud sticks, but no mud is immortal, and that senile fling at the name of Seward is the last flickering, dying word of detraction that can be heard in the town that was his home for full half a century, or in the land he served so well. And yet it was in Auburn that mob spirit once found a voice, and when Seward was Lincoln's most helpful adviser, and his sons were at the front serving the country's cause, cries of "Burn his house! Burn his house!" came to the distracted ears of wife and daughter. But all that is gone now. In fact, denial that calumny was ever offered to the name of Seward springs quickly to the lips of Auburn men, as they point with pride to that beautiful old home where he lived, and where now his son resides, and then they lead you, with a reverence that nearly uncovers, to the stately bronze standing on the spot that was once his garden, now a park belonging to the people. Time marks wondrous changes, and the city where William Lloyd Garrison lived in a rat hole, as reported by Boston's mayor, now honors Commonwealth Avenue with his statue, and so the sons of Seward's enemies have devoted willing dollars to preserving that classic face and spindling form in deathless bronze. And they do well, for Seward's name and fame are Auburn's glory. I may be mistaken, but it seems to me that all the worry of the world is quite useless, and on no subject affecting mortals is there so much worry as on that of, no, not love, parents' ambitions for their children. When the dimpled darling toddles and lisps and chatters, the satisfaction he gives is unalloyed, for he is so small and insignificant, his demands so imperious, that the entire household dance attendance on the wee tyrant, and count it joy. But by and by the things at which we used to laugh become presumptuous, and that which was once funny is now perverse. And the more practical a man is, the larger his stock of Connecticut common sense, the greater his disillusionment as his children grow to manhood. When he beholds dawdling inanity and dowdy vanity growing lush as Jimson, where yesterday, with strained prophetic vision, he saw budding excellence and worth, his soul is wrung by a worry that knows no peace. The matter is so poignantly personal that he dare not share it with another in confessional, and so he hugs his grief to his heart and tries to hide it, even from himself. And thus does many a mother scrub the kitchen floor on her knees, rather than face the irony of maternity and ask the assistance of the 17-year-old pert chit with bangs, who strums a mandolin in the little front parlor, gay with its paper flowers, 6 plush-covered chairs, and a company sofa. The late Commodore Vanderbilt is reported to have said, "I have over a dozen sons, and not one is worth a damn." I fear me that every father with sons grown to manhood has at some time voiced the same sentiment, curtailed possibly only as to numbers, and softened by another expletive, which does not mitigate the anguish of his cry, as he sees the dreams he had for his baby boys fade away into a mist of agonizing tears. And is all this worry the penalty that nature exacts for dreaming dreams that cannot in their very nature come true? Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote so beautifully on child study, avoided the risk of failure by putting his children into an asylum. Several communities since have set apart certain women to be mothers to all, and bring up and care for the young. And strangely, with no apparent loss to the children. And Bellamy prophesies a day when the worries of parenthood will all be transferred to a committee. But the worry is futile and senseless, being born often of a blindness that will not wait. Man is not only 7 ages, but many more, and he must pass through this one before the next arrives. The Commodore certainly possessed what is called horse sense, and if his conceptions of character had been clearer, he might have realized that in more ways than one the abilities of his sons were going to be greater than his own. His eldest son was, nevertheless, banished to a Long Island farm on a pension, because he could not be trusted to do business. The same son once modestly asked the Commodore if he would allow him to have the compost that had been for a year accumulating outside the Fifth Avenue barns. "Just 1 load and no more," said Pater. William thereupon took 20 teams and as many men and transferred the entire pile to a barge moored in the river. It was a barge load, and when Pater saw what had been done, he said, "The boy is not so big a fool as I thought." The boy was 45 ere death put him in possession of the gold that the father no longer had use for, there being no pockets in a shroud, and he then showed that as a financier he could have given his father points, for in a few years he doubled the millions and drove horses faster without a brake than his father had ever ridden. Seward's father was a doctor, justice of the peace, merchant, and the general first citizen of the village of Florida, Orange County, New York, and he had no more confidence in his boy, William, than Vanderbilt had in his. He educated him only because the lad was not strong enough to work, and it seems to have been the firm belief that the boy would come to no good end. In order to discipline him, the father put the youngster in college on such a scanty allowance that the lad was obliged to run away and go to teaching school in order to be free from financial humiliation. Here was the best possible proof that the young man had the germs of excellence in him, but the father took it as a proof of depravity, and sent warning letters to the young school teacher's friends, threatening them not to harbor the scapegrace. The years went by, and the parental distrust slackened very little. The boy was slim and slender, and his hair was tow-colored, and his head too big for his body. He had gotten a goodly smattering of education some way, and was intent on being a lawyer. He seemed to know that if he was to succeed, he must get well away from the parent nest, and out of the reach of daily advice. His desire was to go "out west," and the particular objective point was Auburn, New York. The father gave him $50 as a starter, with the final word, "I expect you'll be back all too soon." And so young Seward started away, with high hopes and a firm determination that he would agreeably disappoint his parents by not going back. He reached Albany by steamboat, and embarked on a sumptuous canal packet that bore a waving banner on which were the words woven in gold, "Westward Ho!" And he has slyly told us how, as he stepped aboard that inland palace, he bethought him of having written a thesis 3 years before, proving that DeWitt Clinton's chimera of joining the Hudson and Lake Erie was an idea both fictile and fibrous. But the inland palace carried him safely and surely. He reached Auburn, and instead of writing home for more money, returned that which he had borrowed. The father, who was a pretty good man in every way, quite beyond the average in intellect, lived to see his son in the United States Senate. And the moral for parents is, don't worry about your children. You were young once, even if you have forgotten the fact. Boys will be boys and girls will be girls, but not forever. Have patience, and remember that this present brood is not the first generation that has been brought forth. There have been others, and each has been very much like the one that passed before. The sentiment of Pippa Passes holds. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. In 1834, Seward was the Whig candidate for governor of New York. He was defeated by W.L. Marcy. 4 years later he was again a candidate against Marcy, and defeated him by 10,000 majority. Seward was then 36 years of age, and was counted one of the very first among the lawyers of the state, and in accepting the office of governor he made decided financial sacrifices. Seward was a man of positive ideas, and although not arbitrary in manner, yet had a silken strength of will that made great rents in the mesh of other men's desires. Before a court his quiet but firm persistence along a certain line often dictated the verdict. The faculty of grasping a point firmly and securely was his in a marked measure, and any man who can quietly override the wishes and ambitions of other men is first well feared and then thoroughly hated. End of section 22. Section 23 of Little Journeys to the Homes of American Statesmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Little Journeys to the Homes of American Statesmen by Elbert Hubbard. Section 23. William H. Seward, Part 2. One of Seward's first efforts on becoming governor was to ensure a common school education among the children of every class, and especially among the foreign population of large cities. To this end, he advocated a distribution of public funds among all schools established with that object, and if he were alive today, it is quite needless to say he would not belong to the APA, nor to any other secret society. He knew too much of all religions to have complete faith in any, yet his appreciation of the fact that the Catholics minister to the needs of a class that no other denomination reaches or can control was outspoken and plain. This, with his connection with the anti-Masonic party, brought upon his name a stigma that was at last to defeat him for the presidency. Seward's clear insight into practical things, backed by the quiet working energy of his nature, brought about many changes, and the changes he effected and the reforms he inaugurated must ever rank his name high among statesmen. By his influence the law's delay in the courts of chancery was curtailed, and this prepared the way for radical changes to the Constitution. He inaugurated the Geological Survey that led to making Potsdam outcrop classic and Medina sandstone a product that is so known wherever a man goes forth in the fields of earth carrying a geologist's hammer. Largely through his efforts, a safe and general banking system was brought about, and the establishment of a lunatic asylum was one of the best items to his credit during that first term as governor. But there was one philological change that proved too great even for his generalship. The word lunacy, as we know, comes from luna, the belief in the good old days being that the moon exercised a profound influence on the wits of sundry people. I'm told that the idea still holds good in certain quarters, and that if the wind is east and the moon shows a horn on which you can hang a flatiron, certain persons are looked upon askance and the children cautioned to avoid them. Seward said that insane people were simply those who were mentally ill, and that hospital was the proper term. But the classicists retorted, "Nay, nay, William Henry, you have had your way in many things, and here we will now have ours." It has taken us full a century officially to make the change, and the plain folks from the hills still refuse to ratify it, and will for many a lustrum. It was during Seward's administration that the debtors' prison was done away with, and it was, too, through his earnest recommendation that the last trace of law for slaveholding was wiped from the statute books of the state of New York. The question of slavery was taken up most exhaustively in what was known as the Virginia controversy. This interesting correspondence can be seen in a stout volume in most public libraries. It is a series of letters that passed between Governor Seward of New York and the Governor of Virginia, as to the requisition of 2 persons in New York charged by the Governor of Virginia with abducting slaves. Seward made the patent point, and backed it up with a forest of reasons, in politest English, that the accused persons being charged with abducting slaves, and there being no such thing as slaves known in New York, no person in New York could be apprehended for stealing slaves, for slaves were things that had no existence. Then did the Governor of Virginia admit that slaves could not be abducted in New York? But he proceeded to explain in lusty tomes that slavery legally existed in Virginia, and that if slaves were abducted in Virginia, the criminal nature of the act could not be shaken off, because the accused changed his geographical base. Seward was a prince of logicians. The subtleties of reasoning and the smoke of rhetoric were to his fancy, and although there is not a visible smile in the whole Virginia controversy, I cannot but think that his sleeves were puffed with laughter as he searched the universe for reasons to satisfy the haughty first families of Virginia. And all the while, please note that he held the alleged abductors safe and secure 'gainst harm's way. In this correspondence he placed himself on record as an abolitionist of the abolitionists, and the name of Seward became listed then and there for vengeance or immortality. The subject had been forced upon him, and he then expressed the sentiment that he continued to voice until 1865, that America could not exist half free and half slave. It must be a land of slaveholders and slaves, or a land of free men. He was fully and irrevocably committed to the cause. In 1840 he was re-elected governor. The second administration was marked, as was the first, by a vigorous policy of pushing forward public improvements. At the close of his second term, Seward found his personal affairs in rather an unsettled condition, the expenses of official position having exceeded his income. He had had a goodly taste of the ingratitude of republics, and philosopher though he was yet too young to know that his experience in well-doing was not unique, a fact he came to comprehend full well in later years. And so he did that very human thing, declared his intention of retiring permanently from public life. Once back at Auburn, clients flocked to him, and he took his pick of business. And yet we find that public affairs were in his mind. Vexed questions of state policy were brought to him to decide, and journeys were made to Ohio and Michigan in the interests of men charged with slave stealing. There was little money in such practice and small honors, but his heart was in the work. In 1844 Seward entered with much zest into the canvass in behalf of Henry Clay for president, as he thought Clay's election would surely lead the way to general emancipation. In 1848 he supported General Taylor with equal energy. When Taylor was elected, there proved to be a great deal of opposition to him among the members from the South, in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. The administration felt the need of being backed by strong men in the Senate, men who could think on their feet and carry a point when necessary against the opposition that sought to confuse and embarrass the friends of the administration with tireless windmill elocution. From Washington came the urgent request that Seward should be sent to the United States Senate. In 1849 he was chosen senator, and from the first became the trusted leader of the administration party. The year after Seward's election to the Senate, President Taylor died, and Vice President Fillmore, who had the happiness to live in the village of East Aurora, New York, succeeded to the office, but Seward still remained leader of the anti-slavery party. Seward's second term as United States Senator closed in 1861. In 1855, when his first term expired, there was a very strenuous effort made against his re-election. His strong and continued anti-slavery position had caused him to be thoroughly hated both North and South. He was spoken of as a seditious agitator and a dangerous man. But in spite of opposition he was again sent back to Washington. Small, slim, gentle, modest, and low-voiced, he was pointed out in Pennsylvania Avenue as one who reads much and sees quite through the deeds of men. Men who are well traduced and hotly denounced are usually pretty good quality. No better encomium is needed than the detraction of some people, and men who are well hated also have friends who love them well. Thus does the law of compensation ever live. In 1856 there was a goodly little demonstration in favor of Seward for president, but the idea of running such a radical for the chief office of the people was quickly downed, and Seward himself knew the temper of the times too well to take the matter very seriously. But the years between 1856 and 1860 were years of agitation and earnest thought, and the idea that slavery was merely a local question was getting both depolarized and dehorned. The non-slaveholding North was rubbing its sleepy eyes and asking, "Who is this man Seward, anyway?" The belief was growing that Seward, Garrison, Sumner, and Phillips were something more than self-seeking agitators, and many declared them true patriots. In every town and city, in every Northern state, political clubs sprang into being, and their battle cry was "Seward." It seemed to be a foregone conclusion that Seward would be the next president. When the convention met, the first ballot showed 173 votes for Seward and 102 for Lincoln, the rest scattering. But Seward's friends had marshaled their entire strength. All the rest was opposition, while Lincoln was an unknown quantity. When the news went forth that Lincoln was nominated, Seward received the tidings in his library at Auburn, and the myth makers have told us that he cried aloud, and that the carved lions on his gateposts shed salty tears. But Seward knew the opposition to his name, and was of too stern a moral fiber to fix his heart upon the result of a wire-pulling convention. The motto of his life had been, "Be prepared for the unexpected." It may be that the lions on the gateposts shed tears, and it is possible there was weeping in the Seward household, but not by Seward. He entered upon a hearty and vigorous campaign in support of Lincoln, making a tour through the West and being greeted everywhere with an enthusiasm that rivaled that shown for the candidate. Seward said to his wife, when the news came that Lincoln was nominated, "He will be elected, but he will have to face the greatest difficulties and carry the greatest burdens that ever a man has been called to bear. He will need me, but look you, my dear, I will not serve under him. I must be at the head or nowhere." Lincoln knew Seward, and Seward didn't know Lincoln. And so, after the convention, Lincoln journeyed down East. It took 2 days to go from Chicago to Buffalo, and there were no sleeping cars. And then Lincoln went on from Buffalo to Auburn, another day's journey. Lincoln wore his habitual duster and the tall hat, a little the worse for wear. He telegraphed Seward he was coming, and of course Seward met him at the station in Auburn. Lincoln got off the car alone, unattended, carrying his carpet bag, homemade, with the initials A.L. embroidered on the side by the fair hands of Fanny Anna Rebecca Todd. Seward and his 2 sons, William and Frederick, met the coming president, and the boys laughed at the dusty, uncouth, sad, and awkward individual, 6'5", who disembarked. The carriage was waiting, but Lincoln refused to ride, saying, "Boys, let's walk." And they walked up the hill, in through past the stone gateposts where the lions stood that shed tears. Seward ran ahead into the house, and said to his wife, "Look you, my dear, we have misjudged this man. Do not laugh. He is the greatest man in the world." 3 months later, Seward met Lincoln by appointment in Chicago, and from that time on, to the day of Lincoln's death, Seward served his chief with hands and feet, with eyes and ears, and with brain and soul. When Lincoln was elected, his wisdom was at once manifest in securing Seward as Secretary of State. The record of those troublous times and the masterly way in which Seward served his country are too vivid in the minds of men to need reviewing here. But the regard of Lincoln for this man, who so well complemented his own needs, is worthy of our remembrance. Seward was the only member of Lincoln's first cabinet who stood by him straight through and entered the second. Early in April, 1865, Seward met with a serious accident by being thrown from his carriage and dashed against the curbstone. One arm and both jaws were fractured, and besides he was badly bruised in other parts of his body. On April 13th Lincoln returned from his trip to Richmond, where he had had an interview with Grant. That evening he walked over from the White House to Seward's residence. The stricken man was totally unable to converse, but Lincoln, sitting on the edge of the bed and holding the old man's thin hands, told in solemn, serious monotone of the ending of the war, of what he had seen and heard, of the plans he had made for sending soldiers home and providing for an army whipped and vanquished, and of what was best to do to bind up a nation's wounds. 5 years before, these men had stood before the world as rivals. Then they joined hands as friends, and during the 4 years of strife and blood had met each day, and advised and counseled concerning every great detail. Their opinions often differed widely, but there was always frank expression, and in the main their fears and doubts and hopes had all been won. But now at last the smoke had cleared away, and they had won. The victory had been too dearly bought for proud boast or vain exultation, but victory still it was. And as the strong and homely Lincoln told the tale, the stricken man could answer back only by pressure of a hand. At last the presence of the nurse told Lincoln it was time to go. In grave jest he half apologized for his long stay, and told of a man in Sangamon County who used to say there is no medicine like good news. And rumor has it that he then stooped and kissed the sick man's cheek, and then he went his way. The next night at the same hour a man entered the Seward home, saying that he had been sent with messages by the doctor. Being refused admittance to the sick chamber, he drew a pistol and endeavored to shoot Seward's son, who guarded the door, but being foiled in this, he crushed the young man's skull with a heavy weapon, and springing over his body, dashed at the emaciated figure of Seward with uplifted dagger. A dozen times he struck at the face and throat and breast of the almost dying man, and then thinking he had done his work, made rapidly away. At the same time, linked by fate in a sort of poetic justice, with the thought that if one deserved death, so did the other, hate had with sure aim sent an assassin's bullet home, and Lincoln died. Weeks passed, and the strong vitality that had served Seward in such good stead did not forsake him. Men of his stamp are hard to kill. On a beautiful May day, Seward, so reduced that a woman carried him, was taken out on the veranda of his house and watched that solid mass of glittering steel and faded blue that moved through Pennsylvania Avenue in triumphal march. Sherman, with head uncovered, rode down to Seward's home, saluted, and then back to join his goodly company, and many others of lesser note did the same. Health and strength came slowly back, and happy was the day when he was carried to the office of Secretary of State, and propped in his chair again began his work. Another president had come, but meet it was that the Secretary of State should still hold his place. Seward lived full 11 years after that, seemingly dragging with unquenched spirit that slashed and broken form. But the glint did not fade from his eye, nor did the proud head lose its poise. He died in his office among his books and papers, sane and sensible up to the very moment when his spirit took its flight. End of section 23.
Section 24 of Little Journeys to the Homes of American Statesmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey. Little Journeys to the Homes of American Statesmen by Elbert Hubbard. Section 24. Abraham Lincoln, Part 1. The world will little note, no long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Speech at Gettysburg. No, dearie, I do not think my childhood differed much from that of other good healthy country youngsters. I've heard folks say that childhood has its sorrows and all that, but the sorrows of country children do not last long. The young rustic goes out and tells his troubles to the birds and flowers, and the flowers nod in recognition, and the robin that sings from the top of a tall poplar tree when the sun goes down says plainly it has sorrows of its own, and understands. I feel a pity for all those folks who were born in a big city and thus got cheated out of their childhood. Zealous ash-box inspectors in gilt braid, prying policemen with clubs, and signs reading "Keep off the grass," are woeful things to greet the gaze of little souls fresh from God. Last summer 6 fresh heirs were sent out to my farm from the 8th ward. Half an hour after their arrival, one of them, a little girl 5 years old, who had constituted herself mother of the party, came rushing into the house exclaiming, "Say, Mr. Jimmy Driscoll, he's walking on the grass." I will remember the first "Keep off the grass" sign I ever saw. It was in a printed book. It wasn't exactly a sign, only a picture of a sign, and the single excuse I could think of for such a notice was that the field was full of bumblebee nests, and the owner, being a good man and kind, did not want barefoot boys to add bee stings to stone bruises. And I never now see one of those signs but that I glance at my feet to make sure that I have shoes on. Given the liberty of the country, the child is very near to nature's heart. He is brother to the tree and calls all the dumb growing things by name. He is sublimely superstitious. His imagination, as yet untouched by disillusion, makes good all that earth lacks, and habited in a healthy body, the soul sings and soars. In childhood, magic and mystery lie close around us. The world in which we live is a panorama of constantly unfolding delights. Our faith in the unknown is limitless, and the words of Job uttered in mankind's early morning fit our wondering mood. Quote, "He stretcheth out the north over empty space, and hangeth the earth upon nothing." End quote. I am old, dearie, very old. In my childhood, much of the state of Illinois was a prairie, where wild grass waved and bowed before the breeze like the tide of a summer sea. I remember when relatives rode miles and miles in springless farm wagons to visit cousins, taking the whole family and staying 2 nights and a day, when books were things to be read, when the beaver and the buffalo were not extinct, when wild pigeons came in clouds that shadowed the sun, when steamboats ran on the Sangamon, when Bishop Simpson preached, when hell was a place, not a theory, and heaven a locality whose fortunate inhabitants had no work to do, when Chicago newspapers were 10 cents each, when cotton cloth was 50 cents a yard, and my shirt was made from a flour sack with the legend "Extra XXX" across my proud bosom, and just below the words, in flaming red, quote, "Warranted 50 pounds." End quote. The mornings usually opened with smothered protests against getting up, for country folks then were extremists in the matter of, quote, "Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise." End quote. We hadn't much wealth, nor were we very wise, but we had health to burn. But aside from the unpleasantness of early morning, the day was full of possibilities, of curious things to be found in the barn and under spreading gooseberry bushes, or, if it rained, the garret was an Alsatia unexplored. The evolution of the individual mirrors the evolution of the race. In the morning of the world, man was innocent and free, but when self-consciousness crept in and he possessed himself of that disturbing motto, "Know thyself," he took a fall. Yet knowledge usually comes to us with a shock, just as the mixture crystallizes when the chemist gives the jar a tap. We grow by throes. I well remember the day when I was put out of my Eden. My father and mother had gone away in the one-horse wagon, taking the baby with them, leaving me in care of my elder sister. It was a stormy day, and the air was full of fog and mist. It did not rain very much, only in gusts, but great leaden clouds chased each other angrily across the sky. It was very quiet there in the little house on the prairie, except when the wind came and shook the windows and rattled at the doors. The morning seemed to drag and wouldn't pass, just out of contrariness, and I wanted it to go fast because in the afternoon my sister was to take me somewhere, but where I did not know, but that we should go somewhere was promised again and again. As the day wore on, we went up into the little garret and strained our eyes across the stretching prairie to see if someone was coming. There had been much rain, for on the prairie there was always too much rain or else too little. It was either drought or flood. Dark swarms of wild ducks were in all the ponds. V-shaped flocks of geese and brants screamed overhead, and down in the slough cranes danced a solemn minuet. Again and again we looked for the coming something, and I began to cry, fearing we had been left there, forgotten of fate. At last we went out by the barn, and, with much boasting, I climbed to the top of the haystack, and my sister followed, and still we watched. "There they come," explained my sister. "There they come," I echoed, and clapped two red-chapped hands for joy. Away across the prairie, miles and miles away, was a winding string of wagons, a dozen, perhaps, one right behind another. We watched until we could make out our own white horse Bob, and then we slid down the hickory pole that leaned against the stack, and made our way across the spongy sod to the burying ground that stood on a knoll half a mile away. We got there before the procession, and saw a great hole with square corners dug in the ground. It was half full of water, and a man in bare feet, with trousers rolled to his knees, was working industriously to bail it out. The wagons drove up and stopped, and out of one of them 4 men lifted a long box and set it down beside the hole where the man still bailed and dipped. The box was opened, and in it was Si Johnson. Si lay very still, and his face was very blue, and his clothes were very black, save for his shirt, which was very white, and his hands were folded across his breast, just so, and held awkwardly in the stiff fingers was a little New Testament. We all looked at the blue face, and the women cried softly. The men took off their hats while the preacher prayed, and then we sang, quote, "There'll be no more parting there." End quote. The lid of the box was nailed down, lines were taken from the harness of one of the teams standing by and were placed around the long box, and it was lowered with a splash into the hole. Then several men seized spades, and the clods fell with clatter and echo. The men shoveled very hard, filling up the hole, and when it was full and heaped up, they patted it all over with the backs of their spades. Everybody remained until this was done, and then we got into the wagons and drove away. Nearly a dozen of the folks came over to our house for dinner, including the preacher, and they all talked of the man who was dead and how he came to die. Only 2 days before, this man, Si Johnson, stood in the doorway of his house and looked out at the falling rain. It had rained for 3 days, so that they could not plow, and Si was angry. Besides this, his 2 brothers had enlisted and gone away to the war, and left him all the work to do. He did not go to war because he was a, quote, "copperhead," end quote. And as he stood there in the doorway looking at the rain, he took a chew of tobacco, and then he swore a terrible oath. And ere the swear words had escaped from his lips, there came a blinding flash of lightning, and the man fell all in a heap like a sack of oats. And he was dead. Whether he died because he was a copperhead, or because he took a chew of tobacco, or because he swore, I could not exactly understand. I waited for a convenient lull in the conversation and asked the preacher why the man died, and he patted me on the head and told me it was, quote, "the vengeance of God," end quote, and that he hoped I would grow up and be a good man and never chew tobacco nor swear. The preacher is alive now. He is an old, old man with long white whiskers, and I never see him, but that I am tempted to ask for the exact truth as to why Si Johnson was struck by lightning. Yet I suppose it was because he was a copperhead. All copperheads chewed tobacco and swore, and that his fate was merited no one but the living copperheads in that community doubted. That was an eventful day to me. Like men whose hair turns from black to gray in a night, I had left babyhood behind at a bound, and the problems of the world were upon me, clamoring for solution. There was war in the land. When it began, I did not know, but that it was something terrible I could guess. I thought of it all the rest of the day and dreamed of it at night. Many men had gone away, and every day men in blue straggled by, all going south, forever south. And all the men straggling along that road stopped to get a drink at a well, drawing the water with the sweep and drinking out of the bucket and squirting a mouthful of water over each other. They looked at my father's creaking doctor's sign and sang, "Old Mother Hubbard, she went to the cupboard." They all sang that. They were very jolly, just as though they were going to a picnic. Some of them came back that way a few years later, and they were not so jolly. And some there were who never came back at all. Freight trains passed southward, blue with men in the cars, and on top of the cars, and in the caboose, and on the cowcatcher, always going south and never north. For down south were many rebels, and all along the way south were copperheads, and they all wanted to come north and kill us, so soldiers had to go down there and fight them. And I marveled much that if God hated copperheads, as our preachers said he did, why he didn't send lightning and kill them just in a second, as he had Si Johnson. And then all that would have to be done would be to send for a doctor to see that they were surely dead, and a preacher to pray, and the neighbors would dress them in their best Sunday suits of black, folding their hands very carefully across their breasts. Then we would bury them deep, filling in the dirt and heaping it up, patting it all down very carefully with the back of a spade, and then go away and leave them until Judgment Day. Copperheads were simply men who hated Lincoln. The name came from copperhead snakes, which are worse than rattlers, for rattlers rattle and give warning. A rattler is an open enemy, but you never know that a copperhead is around until he strikes. He lies low in the swale and watches his chance. He is the worstest snake that am. It was Abe Lincoln of Springfield who was fighting the rebels that were trying to wreck the country and spread red ruin. The Copperheads were wicked folks at the North who sided with the rebels. Society was divided into two classes, those who favored Abe Lincoln and those who told lies about him. All the people I knew and loved Abe Lincoln. I was born at Bloomington, Illinois, through no choosing of my own, and Bloomington is further famous as being the birthplace of the Republican Party. When a year old, I persuaded my parents to move 7 miles north to the village of Hudson that then had 5 houses, a church, a store, and a blacksmith shop. Many of the people I knew Lincoln, for he used to come to Bloomington several times a year on the circuit to try cases, and at various times made speeches there. When he came, he would tell stories at the Ashley House, and when he was gone, these stories would be repeated by everybody. Some of these stories must have been peculiar, for I once heard my mother caution my father not to tell any more "Lincoln stories" at the dinner table when we had company. And once Lincoln gave a lecture at the Presbyterian Church on the "progress of man," when no one was there but the preacher, my Aunt Hannah, and the sexton. My Uncle Elihu and Aunt Hannah knew Abe Lincoln well. So did Jesse Fell, James C. Conklin, Judge Davis, General Orme, Leonard Swett, Dick Yates, and lots of others I knew. They never called him "Mr. Lincoln," but it was always Abe, or Old Abe, or just plain Abe Lincoln. In that newly settled country, you always called folks by their first names, especially when you liked them. And when they spoke the name Abe Lincoln, there was something in the voice that told of confidence, respect, and affection. Once when I was at my Aunt Hannah's, Judge Davis was there and I sat on his lap. Years afterward, I boasted to Robert Ingersoll that when I wore trousers buttoned to a calico waist, I used to sit on the lap of David Davis, and Colonel Ingersoll laughed and said, "Now I know you're a liar, for David Davis didn't have any lap." The only thing about the interview I remember was that the judge really didn't have any lap to speak of. After Judge Davis had gone, Aunt Hannah said, "You must always remember Judge Davis, for he is the man who made Abe Lincoln." And when I said, "Why, I thought God made Lincoln," they all laughed. After a little pause, my inquiring mind caused me to ask, "Who made Judge Davis?" And Uncle Elihu answered, "Abe Lincoln." Then they all laughed more than ever. Many volunteers were being called for. Neighbors and neighbors' boys were enlisting, going to the support of Abe Lincoln. Then one day my father went away too. Many of the neighbors went with us to the station when he took the 4 o'clock train, and we all cried, except Mother. She didn't cry until she got home. My father had gone to Springfield to enlist as a surgeon. In 3 days he came back and told us he had enlisted and was to be assigned his regiment in a week and go at once to the front. He was always a kind man, but during that week when he was waiting to be told where to go, he was very gentle and more kind than ever. He told me I must be the man of the house while he was away, and take care of my mother and sisters, and not forget to feed the chickens every morning. And I promised. At the end of the week, a big envelope came from Springfield marked in the corner "Official." My mother would not open it, and so it lay on the table until the doctor's return. We all looked at it curiously, and my eldest sister gazed on it long with her lackluster eye, and then rushed from the room with her check apron over her head. When my father rode up on horseback, I ran to tell him that the envelope had come. We all stood breathless and watched him break the seals. He took out the letter and read it silently and passed it to my mother. I have the letter before me now, and it says, quote, "The department is still of the opinion that it does not care to accept men having varicose veins, which make the wearing of bandages necessary. Your name, however, has been filed, and should we be able to use your services, will advise." End quote. Then we were all very glad about the varicose veins, and I'm afraid I went out and boasted to my playfellows about our family possessions. It was not so very long after that there was a big meeting in the "timber." People came from all over the county to attend it. The chief speaker was a man by the name of Ingersoll, a colonel in the army who was back home for just a day or two on furlough. Folks said he was the greatest orator in Peoria County. Early in the morning the wagons began to go by our house, and all along the 4 roads that led to the grove we could see great clouds of dust that stretched away for miles and miles, and told that the people were gathering by the thousands. They came in wagons and on horseback, carrying babies. 2 boys on 1 horse were common sights, and there were various 4-horse teams with wagons filled with girls, all dressed in white, carrying flags. All our folks went. My mother fastened the back door of our house with a bolt on the inside, and then locked the front door with a key, and hid the key under the doormat. End of section 24. Section 25 of Little Journeys to the Homes of American Statesmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey. Little Journeys to the Homes of American Statesmen by Elbert Hubbard. Section 25, Abraham Lincoln, Part 2. At the Grove there was much handshaking and visiting and asking after the folks and for the news. Several soldiers were present, among them a man who lived near us called Little Ramsey. 3 one-armed men were there, and a man named Al Sweetser who had only 1 leg. These men wore blue and were seated on the big platform that was all draped with flags. Plank seats were arranged, and every plank held its quota. Just outside the seats hundreds of men stood, and beyond these were wagons filled with people. Every tree in the woods seemed to have a horse tied to it, and the trees over the speaker's platform were black with men and boys. I never knew before that there were so many horses and people in the world. When the speaking began, the people cheered, and then they became very quiet, and only the occasional squealing and stamping of the horses could be heard. Our preacher spoke first, and then the lawyer from Bloomington, and then came the great man from Peoria. The people cheered more than ever when he stood up, and kept hurrahing so long I thought they were not going to let him speak at all. At last they quieted down, and the speaker began. His first sentence contained a reference to Abe Lincoln. The people applauded, and someone proposed 3 cheers for honest old Abe. Everybody stood up and cheered, and I, perched on my father's shoulder, cheered too. And beneath the legend, "Warranted £50," my heart beat proudly. Silence came at last, a silence filled only by the neighing and stamping of horses and the rapping of a woodpecker in a tall tree. Every ear was strained to catch the orator's first words. The speaker was just about to begin. He raised 1 hand, but ere his lips moved, a hoarse guttural shout echoed through the woods. "Hurrah for Jeff Davis!" "Kill that man!" rang a sharp, clear voice in instant answer. A rumble like an awful groan came from the vast crowd, My father was standing on a seat, and I had climbed to his shoulder. The crowd surged like a monster animal toward a tall man standing alone in a wagon. He swung a black snake whip around him, and the lash fell savagely on two gray horses. At a lunge, the horses, the wagon, and the tall man had cleared the crowd, knocking down several people in their flight. One man clung to the tailboard. The whip wound with a hiss and a crack across his face, and he fell stunned in the roadway. A clear space of full 300 feet now separated the man in the wagon from the great throng, which with 10,000 hands seemed ready to tear him from limb to limb. Revolver shots rang out, women screamed, and trampled children cried for help. Above it all was the roar of the mob. The orator, in vain pantomime, implored order. I saw little Ramsay drop off the limb of a tree, astride of a horse that was tied beneath, then lean over and with one stroke of a knife sever the halter. At the same time 50 other men seemed to have done the same thing, for flying horses shot out from different parts of the woods, all on the instant. The man in the wagon was half a mile away now, still standing erect. The grey horses were running low, with noses and tails outstretched. The spread-out riders closed in a mass and followed at terrific speed. The crowd behind seemed to grow silent. We heard the patter-patter of barefoot horses ascending the long, low hill. One rider on a sorrel horse fell behind. He drew his horse to one side and, sitting over with one foot in the long stirrup, plied the sorrel across the flank with a big white felt hat. The horse responded and crept around to the front of the flying mass. The wagon had disappeared over a gentle rise of ground, and then we lost the horseman too. Still we watched, and 2 miles across the prairie we got a glimpse of running horses in a cloud of dust, and into another valley they settled, and then we lost them for good. The speaking began again, and went on amid applause and tears, with laughter set between. I do not remember what was said, but after the speaking, as we made our way homeward, we met little Ramsay and the young man who rode the sorrel horse. They told us that they had caught the Copperhead after a 10-mile chase, and that he was badly hurt, for the wagon had upset and the fellow was beneath it. Ramsay asked my father to go at once to see what could be done for him. The man, however, was quite dead when my father reached him. There was a purple mark around his neck, and the opinion seemed to be that he had got tangled up in the harness or something. The wartime monks went dragging by, and the burden of gloom in the air seemed to lift. For when the Chicago Tribune was read each evening in the post office, it told of victories on land and sea. Yet it was a joy not untinged with black, for in the church across from our house funerals had been held for farmer boys who had died in prison pens and been buried in Georgia trenches. One youth there was, I remember, who had stopped to get a drink at a pump, and squirted a mouthful of water over me because I was handy. One night the postmaster was reading aloud the names of the killed at Gettysburg, and he ran right on to the name of this boy. The boy's father sat there on a nail keg, chewing a straw. The postmaster tried to shuffle over the name and on to the next. "Hi, wow, what's that you said?" "Killed in honorable battle, Snyder Hiram," said the postmaster with a forced calmness. The boy's father stood up with a jerk. Then he sat down. Then he stood up again and staggered his way to the door and fumbled for the latch like a blind man. "God help him! He's gone to tell the old woman," said the postmaster as he blew his nose on a red handkerchief. The preacher preached a funeral sermon for the boy, and on the little pyramid that marked the family lot in the burying ground they carved the words, quote, "Killed in honorable battle, Hiram Snyder, aged 19." End quote. Not long after, strange yellow-bearded men in faded blue began to arrive. Great welcomes were given them, and at the regular Wednesday evening prayer meeting, thanksgivings were poured out for their safe return, with names of company and regiment duly mentioned for the Lord's better identification. Bees were held for some of these returned farmers, where 20 teams and 50 men, old and young, did a season's farm work in a day and split enough wood for a year. At such times the women would bring big baskets of provisions, and long tables would be set, and there were very jolly times, with cracking of many jokes that were veterans, and the day would end with pitching horseshoes, and at last with singing Auld Lang Syne. It was at one such gathering that a ghost appeared, a lank saffron ghost, ragged as a scarecrow, wearing a foolish smile and the cape of a cavalryman's overcoat, with no coat beneath it. The apparition was a youth of about 20, with a downy beard all over his face and countenance well mellowed with cold soot, as though he had ridden several days on top of a freight car that was near the engine. This ghost was Hiram Snyder. All forgave him the shock of surprise he caused us, all except the minister who had preached his funeral sermon. Years after, I heard this minister remark in a solemn, grieved tone, quote, "Hiram Snyder is a man who cannot be relied on." End quote. As the years pass, the miracle of the seasons means less to us. But what country boy can forget the turning of the leaves from green to gold, and the watchings and waitings for the first hard frost that ushers in the nutting season? And then the first fall of snow, with its promise of skates and sleds and tracks of rabbits and mayhap bears, and strange animals that only come out at night and that no human eye has ever seen? Beautiful are the seasons, and glad I am that I have not yet quite lost my love for each. But now they parade past with a curious swiftness. They look at me out of wistful eyes, and sometimes one calls to me as she goes by and asks, "Why have you done so little since I saw you last?" And I can only answer, "I was thinking of you." I do not need another incarnation to live my life over again. I can do that now, and the resurrection of the past through memory that sees through closed eyes is just as satisfactory as the thing itself. Were we talking of the seasons? Very well, dearie, the seasons it shall be. They are all charming, but if I were to wed any, it would be spring. How well I remember the gentle perfume of her comings and her warm, languid breath. There was a time when I would go out of the house some morning, and the snow would be melting, and spring would kiss my cheek, and then I would be all aglow with joy, and would burst into the house and cry, "Spring is here! Spring is here!" For you know, we always have to divide our joy with someone. One can bear grief, but it takes two to be glad. And then my mother would smile and say, "Yes, my son, but do not wake the baby." Then I would go out and watch the snow turn to water, and run down the road in little rivulets to the creek that would swell until it became a regular Mississippi, so that when we waded the horse across, the water would come to the saddle girth. Then once I remember the bridge was washed away, and all the teams had to go round and through the water, and some used to get stuck in the mud on the other bank. It was great fun. The first, quote, "spring beauties," end quote, bloomed very early in that year. Violets came out on the south side of rotting logs, and cowslips blossomed in the slough as they never had done before. Over on the knoll, prairie chickens strutted pompously and proudly drummed. The war was over. Lincoln had won, and the country was safe. The jubilee was infectious, and the neighbors who used to come and visit us would tell of the men and boys who would soon be back. The war was over. My father and mother talked of it across the table, and the men talked of it at the store, and earth, sky, and water called to each other in glad relief, "The war is over." But there came a morning when my father walked up from the railroad station very fast and looking very serious. He pushed right past me as I sat in the doorway. I followed him into the kitchen where my mother was washing dishes, and heard him say, "They've killed Lincoln," and then he burst into tears. I had never before seen my father shed tears. In fact, I had never seen a man cry. There is something terrible in the grief of a man. Soon the church bell across the road began to toll. It tolled all that day. 3 men, I can give you the names, rang the bell all day long, tolling, slowly tolling, tolling until night came and the stars came out. I thought it a little curious that the stars should come out, for Lincoln was dead. But they did, for I saw them as I trotted by my father's side down to the post office. There was a great crowd of men there. At the long line of peel hickory hatching poles were dozens of saddle horses. The farmers had come for miles to get details of the news. On the long counters that ran down each side of the store, men were seated, swinging their feet and listening intently to someone who was reading aloud from a newspaper. We worked our way past the men who were standing about, and with several of these my father shook hands solemnly. Leaning against the wall near the window was a big, red-faced man whom I knew as a Copperhead. He had been drinking, evidently, for he was making boozy efforts to stand very straight. There were only heard a subdued buzz of whispers and the monotonous voice of the reader as he stood there in the centre, his newspaper in one hand and a lighted candle in the other. The red-faced man lurched 2 steps forward and in a loud voice said, "Lincoln is dead, and I'm damned glad of it." Across the room I saw 2 men struggling with little Ramsay. Why they should struggle with him I could not imagine, but ere I could think the matter out, I saw him shake himself loose from the strong hands that sought to hold him. He sprang upon the counter, and in one hand I saw he held a scale weight. Just an instant he stood there, and then the weight shot straight at the red-faced man. The missile glanced on his shoulder and shot through the window. In another second the red-faced man plunged through the window, taking the entire sash with him. "You'll have to pay for that window," called the alarmed postmaster out into the night. The store was quickly emptied, and on following outside no trace of the red man could be found. The earth had swallowed both the man and the 5-pound scale weight. After some minutes had passed in a vain search for the weight and the Copperhead, we went back into the store and the reading was continued. But the interruption had relieved the tension, and for the first time that day men in that post office joked and laughed. It even lifted from my heart the gloom that threatened to smother me, and I went home and told the story to my mother and sisters, and they too smiled, so closely akin are tears and smiles. The story of Lincoln's life had been ingrained into me long before I ever read a book. For the people who knew Lincoln and the people who knew the people that Lincoln knew were the people I knew. I visited at their houses and heard them tell what Lincoln had said when he sat at table where I then sat. I listened long to Lincoln's stories, and, "and that reminds me," was often on the lips of those I loved. All the tales told by the faithful Herndon and the needlessly loyal Nicolay and Hay were current coin, and the rehearsal of the Lincoln-Douglas debate was commonplace. When our own poverty was mentioned, we compared it with the poverty that Lincoln had endured and felt rich. I slept in a garret where the winter's snow used to sift merrily through the slab shingles, but then I was covered with warm buffalo robes, and a loving mother tucked me in and on my forehead imprinted a good-night kiss. But Lincoln at the same age had no mother, and lived in a hut that had neither windows, doors, nor floor, and a pile of leaves and straw in the corner was his bed. Our house had 2 rooms, but one winter the Lincoln home was only a shed enclosed on 3 sides. I knew of his being a clerk in a country store at the age of 20, and that up to that time he had read but 4 books, of his running a flatboat, splitting rails, and poring at night over a dog-eared law book, of his asking to sleep in the law office of Joshua Speed, and of Speed's giving him permission to move in, and of his going away after his "worldly goods," and coming back in 10 minutes carrying an old pair of saddlebags, which he threw in a corner, saying, "Speed, I've moved." I knew of his 20 years of country law practice, when he was considered just about as good and no better than a dozen others on that circuit, and of his making a bare living during that time. Then I knew of his gradually awakening to the wrong of slavery, of the expansion of his mind, so that he began to incur the jealousy of rivals and the hatred of enemies, and of the prophetic feeling in that slow but sure moving mind that "a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." I knew of the debates with Douglas and the national attention they attracted, and of Judge Davis's remark, "Lincoln has more common sense than any other man in America," and then, chiefly through Judge Davis's influence, of his being nominated for president at the Chicago Convention. I knew of his election and the coming of the war and the long, hard fight when friends and foes beset, and none but he had the patience and the courage that could wait. And then I knew of his death, that death which then seemed a calamity, terrible in its awful blackness. But now the years have passed, and I comprehend somewhat of the paradox of things, and I know that this death was just what he might have prayed for. It was a fitting close for a life that had done a supreme and mighty work. His face foretold the end. Lincoln had no home ties. In that plain frame house, without embellished yard or ornament, where I have been so often, there was no love that held him fast. In that house there was no library, but in the parlor, where 6 haircloth chairs and a slippery sofa to match stood guard, was a marble table on which were various gift books in blue and gilt. He only turned to that home when there was no other place to go. Politics, with its attendant travel and excitement, allowed him to forget the what might have beens. Foolish bickering, silly pride, and stupid misunderstanding pushed him out upon the streets, and he sought to lose himself among the people. And to the people at length he gave his time, his talents, his love, his life. Fate took from him his home that the country might call him savior. Dire tragedy was a fitting end, for only the souls who have suffered are well loved. Jealousy, disparagement, calumny have all made way, and North and South alike revere his name. The memory of his gentleness, his patience, his firm faith, and his great and loving heart are the priceless heritage of a united land. He had charity for all, and malice toward none. He gave affection, and affection is his reward. Honor and love are his. End of section 25. End of Little Journeys to the Homes of American Statesmen by Elbert Hubbard.